Welcome back, fellow football fanatics. It's College Football with Sam. And something that I'm very excited about this week is that we finally have football. In just about, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, little head count. In 5 days, at noon Eastern Standard Time, Florida State and Georgia Tech will kick off in Ireland. And why I'm excited for that game is I think that the two teams participating in the college football kickoff in Aviva Stadium are better than much of the college football world believes. We're going to be previewing that game today. I'm also going to be talking about who my top 10 offenses and top 10 defenses are heading into the 2024 college football season. So it is a jam-packed show today where we're going to dive deep on a handful of topics. Florida State versus Georgia Tech is the best thing to talk about and the thing I'm most excited to talk about. So we're going to be saving that for last and kicking it off with top 10 defenses and top 10 offenses. Something that I also like about this time of the season is that we have something called fantasy football. And fantasy football is really the only way anyone can ever get me to watch an NFL game. But I'm not that interested in the NFL as is, so fantasy is just kind of something that can be a little fun, but that's just it. It's not really exciting, doesn't pump me up, and I really wish there was something like that for college football. But, oh wait, there is. Squadblitz is sponsoring today's show. Squadblitz reached out to me, and they're an app for fantasy football, but the kick is, instead of drafting college football players, you get to draft a college football team, an entire roster, and the stats, the touchdowns, the on-field performance by the team as a whole, by the offense, defense, and special teams, determines whether you win or lose a football game. So you just don't have to have minimal knowledge and do the least amount of effort and just draft some popular player and cash in. You can't just draft Travis Hunter or Shedeur Sanders or Donovan Edwards or Quinn Ewers or Carson Beck or Will Howard, Quinshon Judkins, Travion Henderson, etc. You have to know the team, and you have to be aware of, just like in NFL fantasy football, when the bye weeks are, and pick your teams and strategize accordingly. During this live show, my Squadblitz Leagues draft is going on, so I am going to be tuning in and out, talking about what team I'm drafting and why I'm drafting them. So if I switch topics really quickly, it was a bad snap, but is what it is. I'm not good at snapping. If I switch topics very quickly and start talking about my draft, that's what this is. Squadblitz is very enjoyable. It's something that is right now very small, but it's enjoyable and it's going to grow. It'll be a thing in whether it is next year or sooner than that or further down the road. The people who have created this app have done their research, done their due diligence. So join Squadblitz. You can do that by going to the App Store, whether it is on Google Play or the Apple App Store. Just type in Squadblitz, and the decal, the logo that you see on the screen, that's SB with a green shield, they'll pop up. You can download it. You can create your own league. You can send invites to emails of your friends, family, anyone who's interested. It's all for free. And if you want to join my personal Squadblitz League, there are only 10 slots available. But send me an email at collegefootballwithsam@gmail.com. You can go to my YouTube channel's description, and in the contact section, you can contact me through my email. Contact me with your email, and the first 10 emails to contact me, I will put them in the register, send out invites, and we can have a nice dynasty together this 2024 season. And the draft for this league is in 2 days, in exactly 48 hours, or a little more like 47 hours. It's at 7:30 p.m. on Wednesday. I'll change that if need be. But if all of you, 10 of you at least, can send me an email, I'll try and get you all in, and we'll have a blast. So thank you to Squadblitz for sponsoring this live show, and let's get down to business. My draft turn is going to be up soon, so we're going to be switching topics fairly soon. But I want to start off with college football's best defenses. Who do you think college football's best defenses will be? I look at teams like, whether it's Oklahoma, who should have a stacked defense. I look at Utah. I look at Nebraska, Notre Dame, Oregon, Florida State, Georgia, Penn State, Michigan, Ohio State, and Iowa. A sneaky team who could have one of college football's best defenses is Iowa State, with how much they bring back and the fact that they have some of the best safeties in college football. That's a sneaky pick. And I think Wisconsin, Rutgers, Alabama are other teams that could be up there. LSU and USC have some of the best defensive staffs in the country in my mind. They made genius hires entering 2024, but I think it will take a while for them to get set and for the roster to be taught and developed properly and to be tweaked to the scheme and the scheme to be tweaked to the roster. Blake Baker and D'Anton Lynn are geniuses. They're top 10 defensive coordinators. But Jim Knowles, in my mind, is a top 5 defensive coordinator, and it took him more than a year to fix Ohio State's defense. At number 10, just starting at the top 10, we'll save the best for last and really zone in on that top 5, top 6, top 4 defenses that I would classify easily as elite. I got the Clemson Tigers. Clemson has guys like Peter Woods. And Peter Woods is their main player defensively who I look at. He's switching to defensive end this year. They also have TJ Parker, Peyton Page on a defensive line that has just been loaded with blue chip talent year over year over year, constantly sends guys to the NFL. Wes Goodwin and Mickey Kahn commanded a defense that was top 5 in efficiency last year. And Peter Woods and TJ Parker and Peyton Page each got some playing time. Woods got significant playing time. Barrett Carter was a starter last year, and I think he's the ACC's best linebacker. Wade Woodaz is another player at the linebacker room who's ready to step up for Clemson. Khalil Barnes, RJ Mickens, Avion Terrell, who started in some games or at least had significant playing time as a true freshman last season at corner for Clemson. Jaden Lucas, also in the cornerback room, and Khalil Barnes and RJ Mickens are some of the better safeties, not just in the ACC, but in college football in general. Defense has been Clemson's strength under Dabo Swinney as long as I can remember. In particular, their defensive front. They should once again have a solid defensive front this season, and I think more than that, their secondary will be good. So they lose a lot of players to the NFL, but I think that they're going to come closer to reloading rather than falling apart. I do think they'll regress compared to 2023, but overall still be one of college football's best defenses. At number 9, we have the Nebraska Cornhuskers. Nebraska had a top 20 defense last year statistically. Now, you can argue whether or not it was puffed up by bad Big Ten West offenses playing Nebraska, but Nebraska has the talent with a guy like Nash Hutmacher, who had around 5 sacks last year, and a linebacker like John Bullock and Javin Wright, and more importantly, I think, a secondary that features Tommy Hill, who had several interceptions last year, Bly Hill, Isaac Gifford, Deshaun Singleton, and more importantly, Tony White, who turned Nebraska from a defense that was well outside of the top 50 in 2022 to a defense that was top 5 in rushing yards allowed per game, and I think rushing yards per carry allowed per game, and top 20 in scoring defense last year. And Tony White wanted to pursue a head coaching job. Nebraska was able to retain him and I think give him a raise. What a big addition for Nebraska. What a big retention, rather. A big addition, though, is in Bly Hill at corner, and also adding a linebacker whose name I forget from Syracuse, who was very productive there. Nebraska's defense is absolutely deep. It's one of the best in all of college football. And this season, maybe it can be even higher than 9th, but certainly I like it inside of the top 10. At 8th, we have the Utah Utes. Utah is always strong in the trenches, at linebacker, and really all around they had crazy, unfortunate, bad injury luck. I think this season, as long as they can stay healthy, they'll have a top 10 defense. Thanks to guys like Keanu Tanuvasa, Junior Tafanu, Logan Fano, Van Fillinger, Connor O'Toole. At linebacker, Lander Barton and Kareem Reed are some of the best in all of college football to do it. I think Lander Barton is an all-American caliber player when healthy. At corner, Zamiah Vaughn and Keenan Johnson are players that have experience and have performed well. A question for this defense, I would say, could be safety. I don't think they have the safeties and really the DBs overall that they used to, but this front is going to be one of the best in college football. They have one of the best defensive lines in the sport and one of the best linebackers in the sport. And Morgan Scaley is a really good defensive coordinator. So I expect this team to overall take steps forward from last year, where they just went 8-4 and played several quarterbacks who were just inadequate and not up to the standard at Utah. The defense carried them in multiple games. The defense will be better this season compared to last season, A, because they don't have to carry the team on their back, and also because it's likely that they will be healthier and they return a lot of production. We have at 7th the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Notre Dame has Benjamin Morrison. They bring back Xavier Watts, Riley Mills, Howard Cross III, Jack Kaiser. Al Golden and Al Washington have done a really good job recruiting on the defensive side of the ball with several blue chip players. The interesting thing about Notre Dame's defense last year was it finished top 10 in scoring defense. And there were some games where, whether it was against Clemson or Louisville, where they just couldn't catch a break. And they gave up a lot of points to offenses that arguably were not even good or not even great. I'd say Louisville had a good offense, but overall Louisville was not a great team. But against Ohio State, they held the Buckeyes to 17 points and nearly held them to 10. And they did a pretty good job of limiting Duke when Riley Leonard was still healthy. And they forced Caleb Williams to turn the ball over 3 or 4 times. I mean, it was absolutely phenomenal watching what they did to USC's offense, one of the best offenses in the country. Notre Dame, with the talent they have, definitely has a higher ceiling than just being the 7th best defense in all of college football. They could be better. They have an easier schedule than last year. They bring back, as I said, 4 or 5 players who could be All-American caliber. I think Xavier Watts and Benjamin Morrison definitely are All-American caliber, and we don't need to discuss that. But I'm having Notre Dame at 7th right here just because I need to see more consistency, and also losing J.D. Bertrand at linebacker, losing Javonte Jean-Baptiste at defensive end, and with just some of the inconsistencies they had last season, I'm not yet putting them in that elite spot. We have Florida State at 6th. Florida State is a team who last year on defense was very underrated, particularly in defending the pass. They were up there with Ohio State, Iowa, and Michigan. Their weakness was stopping the run. But fear not, because what they've done in the transfer portal, bringing in Marvin Jones Jr. and also Cam Riley. Marvin Jones Jr. was a backup at Georgia last year. Cam Riley was a starting linebacker, I believe, or a rotational one at minimum at Auburn. Bringing them in and returning Patrick Payton, who had close to 10 sacks last season or around that number. Joshua Farmer and Darrell Jackson Jr. are players on the interior that are ready to step up. I mean, they lost Jared Verse and Braden Fisk last year on the defensive line, 2 big losses to the NFL. And they actually could get better on the defensive line because Florida State was outside of the top 25 in rushing yards per game allowed, and they did not have one of the nation's best run defenses. They They just weren't. I don't know exactly why, and pardon the dog, whatever. This is one of the downsides of, still living at home. But hopefully I can get out soon. Shaheem Brown at safety is a player that I like. And at corner, they have one of the best in Azariah Thomas and also Fentrell Cypress II, who kind of had a quiet year last season. He had no interceptions, neither did Azariah Thomas, but they each had close to double-digit passes deflected. They were rated highly by PFF and are some of the best cornerbacks in the country. It also helps Florida State that they bring back kicker Ryan Fitzgerald and punter Alex Mastromano. And good special teams always helps the defense perform at a high level. So those are 10 through 5 defensively. I want to get into the top 5 defenses in all of college football and really preview them. We have Georgia at 5th. Georgia is a team that fascinates me because it's Kirby Smart. They brought in Travaris Robinson, who was the co-defensive coordinator and secondary coach at Alabama, did a very good job recruiting and developing NFL players. Glenn Schumann is there as the main defensive coordinator. Will Muschamp is still there in an analyst role nonetheless, but you know that he's helping out. And Georgia was just so good last season at defending the pass. And they had the ceiling to have one of the better defenses in all of college football. But much like Florida State, what happened is their rushing defense was lacking in multiple ways. They allowed 6.8 rushing first downs per game, which was 23rd, and they allowed 3.7 yards per rush attempt, which was 30th. Now, that's good for the average college football defense, but for Georgia and Kirby Smart, that's bad. And I know that Kirby Smart wants Warren Brinson, Nazir Stackhouse, Michael Williams, Chaz Chambliss, and some recruits that have now had a year or two to nurture and develop to step up on that defensive line. I think the good news for Georgia is just the strength that they have at linebacker. The fact that Smile Munden Jr. and C.J. Allen and Jalen Walker are in the same room. And Jamin Dumas Johnson transferred out to Kentucky, and he's a good linebacker, but he transferred out because even though he's great, he wasn't guaranteed a starting position because Georgia's just that competitive defensively. Malachi Starks and Dalen Everett are really the players to pay attention to. They had significant playing time and started last season, but the other secondary players departed, including Tyke Smith, who was pretty good last season. I expect Ja'Cory Thomas and Julian Humphrey to step up, and there are probably other players that I'm not even naming here who could come out of nowhere and just have really good seasons. So Georgia is my 5th best defense in college football entering 2024. At 4th, we have the Penn State Nittany Lions. This is where things get interesting because Penn State, Ohio State, Michigan, and Iowa all had phenomenal defenses. Penn State, defensively, they only allowed 13.8 offensive points per game. They only allowed 1.6 offensive touchdowns per game, both 4th nationally in those categories. They allowed 0.216 opponent points per play, also 4th. They only allowed 2 red zone score attempts per game, that was 2nd. And they only allowed 1.8 red zone scores per game in terms of touchdowns and field goals. That was 7th. They were really good last year, that Manny Diaz defense was. They sacked opponents for 12.47% of their dropbacks. That was 1st in the nation by a mile. And they, when you look at the run defense, and it was inflated, definitely, by sacks, because in college football, and this is stupid, sacks are factored in to opponent rushing yards. But nonetheless, only allowing 75 opponent rushing yards per game and only allowing opponents to average 2.2 yards per carry on the ground, even factoring in the sacks, is very impressive. And they were number 1 in both of those categories, and they only allowed 5.6 rushing first downs per game, which was 8th. And out of the other three Big Ten defenses that were in the elite of college football, they were only behind Iowa, Michigan, and Ohio State in that category. They were a very good defense, and I think they'll be good again this year because of what they bring back on the defensive line, linebacker, and safety. Devon J. Thomas is their best defensive tackle, and they have four others behind him who can play high-level football. Abdul Carter and Donnie Dennis Sutton each had around 3 or 4 sacks each last season. Carter was a linebacker who's transitioning to defensive end. Donnie Dennis Sutton is a defensive end who was a 5-star, a part of Drew Aller, Nicholas Singleton, and Katron Allen's 2022 recruiting class. Now in his redshirt sophomore year, I think he's ready to step up. At linebacker, Tony Roas played as a true freshman last season. More importantly, Penn State returns starter Kobe King, who is one of the Big Ten's better linebackers. And Kevin Winston Jr. and Jalen Reed make up one of the best safety duos in the country. Corner is a question mark, but Penn State brings in A.J. Harris from Georgia, former 5-star recruit, and I think with Terry Smith's coaching, they will be great. Penn State has great coaches on the defensive line, linebacker, defensive back, safety, not secondary, but safety with Anthony Poindexter, who's the co-defensive coordinator and safeties coach. Tom Allen is the new defensive coordinator, and I think that Allen, while he hasn't been a defensive coordinator in a long time, he's inheriting one of the best rosters on the defensive side of the ball that you could ask for. So, good on Penn State. I think they're going to have the nation's 4th best defense, which is what I thought they had last year. It was either the 3rd or 4th best defense. I can't decide where it was in placement with Iowa's, but we'll get to Iowa. First and foremost, I want to get to Michigan. Michigan in 2023 only allowed, just listen to this, this is crazy. They only allowed 13.3 opponent first downs per game. That was first by a pretty good margin. They only allowed 3.8 opponent third down conversions per game. That was 4th. They were first in opponent yards per game. They were also first in opponent second half points allowed, first in opponent offensive touchdowns per game, first in opponent offensive points per game, only allowing 10.5. And in pass defense, which was really Ohio State's forte last season, Michigan was first in opponent passing first downs per game, only allowing 7. They only allowed 157 opponent passing yards per game, and this is factoring in the fact they played Michael Penix Jr. and Kyle McCord. And I know that Jalen Milroe was inconsistent last year, but he threw a very good deep ball, and most secondaries at least would fall for it once. They would allow 1 or 2 deep shots to connect, and that could be the end of it. Michigan contained Jalen Milroe, and he didn't do anything that whole game except for scramble a little bit, and because of that, Michigan was able to stay in it while playing one of their worst performances all around of the season and coming out with a Rose Bowl win. Michigan, though, loses a lot on defense, perhaps more than any defense we're talking about today. They only bring back around half of their production from last season. They lose Mikey Sainristil, Josh Wallace, Chris Jenkins, Braden McGregor, Jalen Harrell, both of their starting linebackers. Who they return, though, is equally as important as who they lost. They bring back Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant, Josiah Stewart and Derek Moore. Ernest Hausman and incoming transfer Jayshun Barham are ready to step up. And in the secondary, Rod Moore is hurt, which is sad. Prayers to him, and we hope that he heals up. For Makari Page, we whatchamacallit, even with Rod Moore's injury, there's plenty of depth around to step up. Will Johnson is one of the nation's best cornerbacks. I think the best in the country, actually. And Makari Page, Quentin Johnson, and Jair Hill, along with Zeke Berry, are players to pay attention to. Wink Martindale is the new defensive coordinator. He's very blitz happy. And I think that Michigan will have a superior pressure rate and do a better job at getting to the quarterback compared to last season. A weakness similar to Utah's, though, is secondary depth. That is a weakness. And before, and by weakness, I mean in comparison to the rest of the unit, Michigan's front may be the best in the country. Their secondary will still be top 10, if not top 5. Speaking of elite defenses, right now I'm going to pick a team on Squadblitz, as I was talking to you earlier. It is my turn to draft, and I am going to do something that I may regret, but I don't think I will. And I am going to pick Iowa. Now, the reason I'm going to pick Iowa is because they have, in my mind, the nation's best defense entering 2024, believe it or not. And I already have drafted Oregon and Miami, who I think will have top 10 offenses. So a little preview of who I have in my top 10 offenses. But we'll get to Iowa after we get to Ohio State. Ohio State has the second best defense in college football entering 2024 because they return more than half of their starters in production on that side of the ball from a defense that was only behind Michigan's last year. They were second in points per play allowed, in offensive points per game allowed, in yards per game allowed, in defensive yards per point. They seriously were one of college football's best defenses. Their biggest weakness is kind of the inverse of Michigan's this season. It's the front. They have questions up on the front because they like to line up in a wide technique, which allows opponents to run on them. Their pass rush has been questionable, really, since I would say the end of 2019 for Ohio State in general, and they're replacing both of their starting linebackers. Cody Simons had rotational playing time, but Tommy Eichenberg and Steel Chambers were starters last year, and they're gone. But Ohio State does bring back Tui Moalau, Jack Sawyer. They bring in Caleb Downs from Alabama, and Jordan Hancock, Denzel Burke, Davison Igbinosun, and Lathan Ransom. And Sonny Styles are back, but Styles will now be starting at linebacker, not playing at safety. Also, on the interior, Tyleik Williams and Ty Hamilton come back, and both of them are up there in terms of defensive tackle play. In fact, I would say both of them are top 10 defensive tackles nationally. Ohio State's defense is very good, and it helps that they have Larry Johnson coaching the defensive line, Tim Walton coaching the corners. It helps that Jim Knowles is the defensive coordinator. I think that he is one of the best defensive coordinators in college football right now, only behind Iowa's Phil Parker. Let's just talk about Iowa. Why don't we? We can keep this short and sweet. And I say that because I've already made tons of content on Iowa and why I think they'll have the nation's best defense. And a little sweet spot is the fact that they'll also have the nation's best special teams unit. I look at the Hawkeyes and they bring back nearly 90% of their production on defense. From a defense that last year was first in, they were, I kid you not, they were first in yards per play allowed. There it is. They only allowed 3.9 yards per play, and I saw a statistic today that said Iowa was by far, out of all the Big Ten teams, like the number one defense in terms of how many snaps per game they were on the field, like for the year. They were on the field for over 600 total plays. That's insane, especially you talk about insane with the new clock rules where the games have been shortened. And Iowa is just, with that pathetic offense, they're on the field, punting, flipping the field, desperately trying to get their quarterback, who has the mobility of like a cement block, to throw the football and to not take tons of sacks because the offensive line is terrible. And the defense still held opponents to around 14 points per game, while the offense only scored about 15 points per game. And there you have it. Iowa went 10-2 in the regular season and 10-4 overall. They should be better on offense this year. And defensively, with how much they bring back and the fact that they had a bad year, a worse year than average in terms of forcing turnovers, I do think Iowa is going to force more than 1.1 turnovers per game, which was outside the top 100 last season. Iowa was also second in opponent punts per play, which is a very interesting statistic. Basically, for every 10th of a play that an opponent had, they made one punt. That's pretty good. And Michigan, Ohio State, and Penn State were very close to Iowa in that category as well. Iowa forced a total of 2.3 opponent punts per offensive score, which was fourth. They were fifth in opponent yards per game allowed, only allowing 281.9, while their offense, just wait for this jaw-dropping statistic, their offense in total only had 235.4 yards per game. That was dead last in all of college football, 133rd. With Tim Lester as the offensive coordinator, the offense returns a bunch, especially on the O-line and at tight end and running back, which are Iowa's strengths, if you can call that an offense. I know seriously you can with tight end and center. Those are good positions. And I think running back's underrated too. But talking about offense with Iowa, the reason I'm doing it is because any amount of increase for offensive production for Iowa, what that will do is that will help their defense become a better unit. So with myself, and I think many others who look at Iowa expecting offensive improvement and defensive improvement just based off of returning production, take the expected offensive improvement and add that already to your anticipated defensive improvement. You'll have college football's best defense, and perhaps it won't even be close. Okay, so we're done with that, and what I want to do right now is get to a super chat of all of yours that you have been very patiently waiting for. This is from Will 8282, and I've just been, as you can tell, just from trying to set all of this up and also the dog barking, it's been a long day, but everyone has long days. So Will _8282, thank you for the $5 super chat. Ohio State's depth is the reason they win the Natty. Their depth is unmatched. Unmatched is in all caps, if you can't tell. So, look, Ohio State's depth is really good. The only team that I would say can match with Ohio State's depth, pound for pound, is probably Georgia. That would be about it. Maybe Oregon, if everything goes their way. I would like to say Alabama with how they recruit, but they got gutted by the portal. I don't think their staff did a good job of developing their players ever since 2021, and they're very young at secondary and on the offensive line. Ohio State does have really good depth, and thanks again, Will, for the $5 super chat. If any of you want me to answer questions you have or reply to your statements, you can send in a super chat and I'll answer it at the end of the video or at the next break, which will be after we talk about our top 10 offenses. But you look at Ohio State's roster, and the reason I would say that Georgia has the better roster and is deeper is because A, Georgia's recruited better over the past, I want to say, since Ohio State's number 2 class in 2021, so 22, 23, and 24. Georgia has had the better recruiting classes. Georgia has also sent more players to the NFL, and they've looked like the better team in 21 and 22. They were the better team those years, and last year it was pretty close. I think Ohio State was slightly better, but Georgia was close, and I think had a favorable matchup on Ohio State, given the limitations Ohio State had on the offensive line, which would have been the way to expose Georgia's questionable defensive line. But really, those 3 superior recruiting classes stacked on top of each other, plus a superior head coach, a better overall staff. Georgia, look, when Georgia gets hurt, they plug and play, or do the best job they can at doing so. I mean, look what happened when Brock Bowers went down, and then Oscar Delp and Rosemy Jack-Saint and all those players in the wide receiver and tight end room, Dylan Bell, they stepped up. For Ohio State, it sometimes feels like when they suffer an injury, they are just hanging on by a thread. And maybe I'm not viewing that properly, but like last season against Penn State, Henderson goes down and the entire offensive line is exposed for the can of worms that it was. Or if Marvin Harrison Jr. went down instead of Emeka Egbuka, you may be talking about an Ohio State team that goes 10-2 and wouldn't even wouldn't even be in the playoff conversation, because if they beat Michigan, they would be. But if, like, let's say Penn State beats them but loses to Michigan, you got an 11-1 tie for the Big Ten East, and they're not even in control of their own destiny. So Ohio State, I understand the sentiment that their roster's the best in college football, and it very well could be. But Georgia, I'll say this, Georgia returns more production, they've recruited better, they have the better head coach, and Georgia's schedule's tough, so they can get worn down, but Ohio State's schedule is one of the toughest in the Big Ten and one of the toughest nationally as well. So I'm curious to see if these two teams match up, if I'm proven right, if I'm proven wrong. I might even think differently if they do match up, because we're not even at week 0. We're at the precipice of week 0, but we're not there yet. Thank you again, Will8282, for really sponsoring this video. That's what these super chats are. The super chats are your personal sponsorship and support for videos and live streams like this. And thanks again, speaking of sponsors, to Squadblitz for sponsoring this live stream. Again, email me at collegefootballwithsam, spelled exactly as is, at gmail.com. The first, I think it's 9 people, because I'm the 10th, the first 9 people that email me, I'll send you an email with the invite to my dynasty for Squadblitz, which is college football, fantasy football, college fantasy football. So that sounds fun. I know it does to me. It has to you as well. Anyone who's a college football fan, I think, would love a system like that. And Squadblitz has created it. So check it out. All right, let's get back to business and talk about the top 10 offenses. And then we'll get into Florida State and Georgia Tech. And Florida State also, hey, Chimichanga guy, nice to see you on here. And no problem about being late. This is the beauty of YouTube or Spotify or anything. You can just rewatch the whole thing. But let's get back into the top 10 offenses, shall we? And college football's best offenses are fascinating for a variety of reasons. A, you have the new clock rules, which were instituted last year. And I think the new clock rules, particularly if you have a defense that is one of the nation's best, I think you're incentivized to really slow down the game. Look at Michigan's offense last year, which was much more efficient than in 2022, but they scored almost half a touchdown, or a little more than half a touchdown, less points per game. Part of that is because they played better defenses. Ohio State and Penn State had much better defenses in 2023 than they did in 2022. Michigan's mode of attack was also a little more limited. They still wanted to run the football, especially later in the year when Sharon Moore was the OC, but their offensive line wasn't as good as it was in 2022. Also, Iowa in the Big Ten championship game, for example, had a much better defense than Purdue did. And Alabama had a better defense, and even Washington did, compared to TCU in 2023. So part of it was the fact that Michigan just faced far superior defenses, Nebraska, for example, even, than they did in 2022. I mean, heck, Nebraska's defense last year in 2023, from an average level of play standpoint and an efficiency standpoint, was probably only behind Penn State or Ohio State, and maybe ahead of both when you look at the 2022 Nittany Lion and Buckeye defenses versus the 2023 Cornhuskers defense. And that Cornhuskers defense was not even a top 4 defense that Michigan played last season. But regardless of what I'm saying on that front, because that's less fact and more theory, what's factual is that games were cut by about a few minutes. Not in terms of like commercials and on the field, but just total on the field. Games last season were ending in what traditionally would have been early fourth quarter, end of third quarter. The games were ending. And I think that incentivized offenses to slow down a bit. But not all of them, because there were offenses last year like Oregon, who still scored 44 points per game. USC scored north of the 40 mark. So there were some offenses that I think changed or took advantage of the new clock rules. Other offenses that I don't think necessarily did. But that's one thing. B, defenses have caught up. Look at defenses like the 4-2-5, the 3-2-5, the 3-3-5. Defensive additions that add speed to units so that they can better stop offenses like Lincoln Riley's at Oklahoma or USC, or better stop Ohio State's offenses that were terrorizing the Big Ten. Michigan's 4-2-5 Ravens-style defense did a wonderful job against Ryan Day's offense at Ohio State. And Manny Diaz's 4-2-5, 4-3 hybrid defense at Penn State it produced one of the best defenses for Penn State in the James Franklin era. And that's saying something because Brent Pry constantly produced top 10 defenses. But I want to dive into offenses, and first and foremost, start again from number 10 and work our way up. At number 10, I have the Kansas Jayhawks. That's who I have at number 10. At number 10, I have Kansas. Kansas is interesting because they lose Andy Kotelnicki to Penn State. And Kotelnicki was really the mastermind behind that whole offense. But they bring back so many X-Factor players that I can't ignore what they have. Because Jalen Daniels, when healthy, is one of the nation's best quarterbacks. Devin Neal could be a Heisman finalist if Kansas has a phenomenal season, and he's a big reason why. He's their best running back. He had similar statistics to Ollie Gordon last year. He just wasn't used as often and didn't punch it as much in the end zone. So Ollie Gordon was viewed as better, and I think is the better running back. But Devin Neal's very close. Daniel Highshaw Jr., his backup, is also a great running back. They have Bryce Foster, incoming transfer from Texas A&M, Michael Ford Jr., Kobe Baines, and Bryce Cabledew on the offensive line, one of the Big 12's best offensive lines. And Lawrence Arnold, Quentin Skinner, Luke Grimm, Jared Casey, Deshaun Hamilton, those are receivers and tight ends. They make up a receiver room that will allow Jalen Daniels to run downfield because they'll block for him. They'll allow the running backs to gain outside leverage. The offensive line will allow for outside leverage and also inside power. And overall, this is just a system that I think fits Jeff Grimes' offense perfectly, their new offensive coordinator. He's a power spread guy. Well, you have right there up front, you have strength, you have depth, and you have weapons to keep any defense in the country honest. So that's why I have Kansas at 10. At number 9, I have the Ohio State Buckeyes. And the reason I don't have Ohio State higher is because of their offensive line. And some people have noted that I talk about Ohio State maybe more negatively than I do other teams, or at least it appears that way. But it's because I hold Ohio State to a higher standard than other teams. Out of all these teams that I think will have top 10 offenses, in terms of standards and in terms of program, Ohio State is only matched by 2 other programs in terms of expectations and talent that I have in my top 10 offenses. And those 2 programs are inside of the top 4 in terms of how good I think their offenses will be. I think they'll have elite offenses. Ohio State, I think, will have a near elite offense and not quite elite because I have questions about Will Howard and his proclivity to throw interceptions, his low completion percentage, the fact that, yes, he's gutsy, he can create a highlight reel, and he has a strong arm, but turnovers are turnovers. You have to fix the turnovers, and you can't be completing with the receivers that Ohio State has, and his completion percentage will probably go up because of how good his receivers are. They'll adjust for him. You cannot complete only 60% of your passes. Can't do it. The offensive line last year, mediocre in pass block, sometimes below average or bad. Bad. And I mean woefully underperforming in run blocking. You even watched Ohio State's game against Michigan State last year. Michigan State's defensive line was moving Ohio State's offensive line. But Henderson was so quick that it didn't matter because Michigan State really didn't have much talent outside of their defensive line. So no integrity at linebacker, little integrity outside of Jordan Hall, and the secondary was horrible. So once you got past that first level, you could gain on Michigan State's defense. And when it got time for Michigan, and it probably would have been similar with Penn State, even though Henderson didn't play in that game, not much. And even against Notre Dame, outside of that one big run, Henderson did not do a lot. He's one of college football's best running backs. That's not his fault. I'm not pinning those performances on him. It's on the offensive line. The offensive line outside of quarterback is the most important position on offense, and Ohio State's biggest question marks on offense are at the two most important positions for the unit. I do think their offensive line will be a good offensive line, above average. It will not be great nor elite, but it'll be good. It'll be a good unit, and it could be great. I think it has a ceiling of about near elite. I don't think it can be a Joe Moore Award caliber O-line this year, but it can be close. And if they're close to that this season, or maybe I'm wrong and they are a Joe Moore Award caliber O-line, what they have with Judkins, who ran for over 1,000 yards last year, Henderson, who ran for around 900 yards last year and who had over 10 rushing touchdowns, what they bring back in Emeka Egbuka, who was a 1,000-yard receiver in 2022, and what they have even on the O-line at guard, for example, with Donovan Jackson, who's a first-rounder, and Chip Kelly coming in, bringing his system, which will help, I think, hide some of the weaknesses on the O-line, and Will Howard fits perfectly into his system. Just watch out. They're going to have a much better offense than they did last season. We have Penn State at 8th. Penn State, this is something that I think will get scrutiny, and understandably so. But Andy Kotelnicki is the best offensive coordinator in the country, and he takes over a Penn State offense that, in total, along with Penn State's defense, produced the second best team in the regular season when it came to average margin of victory. And Penn State's offense was able to move the ball at times on Michigan's defense. Not very often, because of bad quarterback play, because Michigan's defense was the best in the country last year, and because Mike Yurcich and James Franklin were, I guess, eating glue. I don't know. But removing Yurcich and bringing in Kotelnicki and returning Drew Aller, returning Katron Allen, Nicholas Singleton, a senior rotational player in Nick Dawkins, who will start at center, Ole Vega, Ione, and J.B. Nelson at guard. The interior of the O-line should be strong. They brought in transfer Nolan Rucci at offensive tackle, Tyler Warren and Khalil Dinkins and Andrew Rapelier, or I someone told me the other day I didn't pronounce his name properly, so apologies if I butchered it, but they have a deep tight end room. Penn State's biggest question is their wide receiver room, but I would rather have questions at wide receiver than overall at quarterback or O-line. I think Penn State has questions there too, more so at QB than the O-line, though they've recruited well on the O-line, both bringing in bodies and blue-chip players like Cooper Cousins, Alex Birchmeyer, Jevon Williams, and Drew Aller, with a much better OC and in year 2 with all that experience behind his belt, I think should improve overall as a player. So that's why I have Penn State with a top 10 offense entering the 2024 season. At 7th, we have, drumroll please, the Texas Longhorns. Texas brings back Quinn Ewers. They bring in transfers Matthew Golden, Silas Bolden, and Isaiah Bond at wide receiver, none of whom crossed 1,000 yards, but all were great near-elite wide receivers last season. I think Silas Bolden has a elite ceiling. He was fantastic at Oregon State, who had a very underrated team for their 8-4 regular season record last season. They returned Kelvin Banks, Jake Majors, and even with their injuries at running back, and prayers to Baxter, their main back, CJ Baxter, hopefully he recovers and has a huge 2025 year. Hopefully, if possible, he can return sometime this year and be healthy, but looks like he's out for the season. even with injuries there, they have weapons everywhere in the passing game. Their O-line will be good. Also, don't forget tight end Amari Niblack. Jatavion Sanders was one of the best in the country last year at tight end, and they got a steal bringing in Amari Niblack at tight end to replace him as he went off to the NFL. I think that Texas would be higher, or could be higher, if not for their injuries at running back, but losing Jonathan Brooks and then C.J. Baxter to injury, Brooks to the NFL, and they also lost a freshman whose name I forget to an injury. Their offense is going to be changed. Quinn Ewers left to pass the ball much more than he did last year. And with his inconsistencies, he wasn't even a top 15 QB last year by most metrics. That will be a challenge. So Texas's offense, if they're somehow top 4, or if they're somehow number 1, and they could be, I think it's doubtful, but it's possible, Steve Sarkisian should just hand him the Broyles Award, even though he's a head coach, because to overcome that many injuries and then to coach up Quinn Ewers, the O-line, tight end, and receivers to basically all compensate for losses at running back plus improve would be very impressive. At 6th, I have Miami. With Cam Ward, Damian Martinez, one of the best offensive lines that I could think of, not just in the ACC, but nationally, with Zach Carpenter, Inez Cooper, Francis Mauigoa, Jalen Rivers, Samson Okunlola, and many others, all being developed by Alex Mirabal, who did very well at Oregon. Just look at Penei Sewell in the NFL and how good he's doing. You can thank Alex Mirabal and Sewell for his talents. And then at wide receiver with Restrepo, with Jacoby George, with Samuel Brown, who's being talked about a lot down there in Coral Gables, and Shannon Dawson running the air raid, which that's what Cam Ward ran at Washington State with offensive coordinator Ben Arbuckle. I think this unit is poised to break out. And the good news is they have time. You may not believe that Florida is kind of just an easy game for Miami. And I don't think it's quite an easy game. But for Miami's offense, it should not be that much of a challenge, honestly, with what Florida brings back on defense, the fact that their defense was so bad last season, and they don't have many, if any, X-Factor players on that defense. The bigger question for Miami, I think, against Florida, as my mind sees it right now, maybe further research will change my mind, will be, can they stop Florida? Because Graham Mertz and their receivers and even their running back room with Montrell Johnson out does have talent. But I think that the first defense they're going to face that really has some type of pulse that can truly question them, whether it's at the line of scrimmage or in coverage, will be Virginia Tech, and that's in Week 5. And if you want to go further than that, at Louisville in Week 8 off the bye, or Florida State in Week 9 at home. They have time to get these things situated with the incoming transfers. I think it's all going to work out, and they'll have one of the best offenses in the country. They could actually have the nation's best offense. You're now getting into territory here where you can be number 1, even if I don't have you predicted to be the number 1 offense. And my criteria for this, by the way, and this goes for my top 10 defense video too, which if you're watching this when it's cut and up on YouTube, check below in the pinned comment for the link to the top 10 defenses video. The criteria for these is just how I think these offenses would all perform against an average, above average, or good power 4 defense. Like, how would they perform against anywhere from the 25th to number 1 defense in college football? I think Miami would be 6th out of all those defenses, or out of all those offenses, rather. We're cracking the top 5. We got the Ole Miss Rebels. Ole Miss with Jackson Dart, with Lane Kiffin commanding everything, and with a tight end in Caden Priestcorn, a running back room that features Logan Diggs and Ulysses Bentley, who each ran over 500 yards last season, with Trey Harris and Jordan Watkins, who are some of the nation's best receivers. And they brought in guards from Washington who were great last season. they were willing to use the portal to support center Caleb Warren, and it will pay off because, yeah, they lost Quinshon Judkins, but Quinshon Judkins made a lot of things happen on his own. And if you're de facto offensive coordinator Lane Kiffin and also the head coach, you want to maximize your team's chances to win, especially against the big boys or the big boy, Georgia, who will be coming to town in November to face Ole Miss. They brought in, at offensive guard from Washington, Nate Kalepo and also Julius Buello, who were some of the better guards in college football last year. Not elite, but close. And they were on a Joe Moore Award-winning offensive line. And with them returning Caleb Warren and experience at offensive tackle as well, and with the weapons they have, and I think most importantly, Jackson Dart. And I think Jackson Dart, if his supporting cast is good, if his receivers improve, if he improves, he could have I think, Jaden Daniels type season. He has the legs, he has the arm, he has the talent, he has the coaching, and I think he even has the schedule to put up some numbers too. Ole Miss does not have a tough schedule. Again, that doesn't factor in these rankings, but what does is Jackson Dart, who I have as an All-American, bless me, quarterback. So that's why I have Ole Miss as the 5th best offense. At 4th, we have the Missouri Tigers. This may surprise some people, but they have a superior offensive line to Ole Miss. Their running back room, adding in Georgia State transfer Marcus Carroll, is going to be good. He ran for over 1,000 yards last year. Brady Cook is a gutsy quarterback, and he improved from 2022 to 2023. And he's been with the program for a while in Drinkwitz's system. So he's smart. He knows the plays. There's nothing new to learn. You could also argue because of his age, there's not much more he can do to improve. But Drinkwitz is a wizard. He'll find a way to make Brady Cook look better than he is if necessary. What I love about Missouri is their offensive line, which features Connor Tollison, Cameron Johnson, Caden Greed, Armand Membo, and especially Luther Burden III, who's the best wide receiver in all of college football. Over 1,000 receiving yards last year, and I believe over 10 receiving touchdowns as well, though correct me if I'm wrong. Also, Theo Weiss and Mookie Cooper are in this wide receiver room. Tight end is going to be an area with question marks. Same with running back. But I think that Drinkwitz will get some things handled this season. If there's any team that will be like Washington last year, playing a bunch of close games, but play up to their competition and beat and play the elite teams like they do even the medium teams, it will be Missouri. I love what Drinkwitz has done at Missouri, particularly on offense, and I think him and Kalen DeBoer share a lot of similarities. That's on top of the fact that they're recruiting well in the SEC, even by the standards of their programs. At 3rd, we have the Oregon Ducks. Oregon brings in Dylan Gabriel, a transfer. They return Tez Johnson. They bring in Evan Stewart. And it's interesting. You look at their trench play, and the interior should take a step back, losing Jackson Powers Johnson. But they bring in a Johnny Cornelius, or they brought him in entering last year. A Johnny Cornelius is there. Josh Connerly Jr. is on the opposite side of a Johnny Cornelius. And that, I think, makes up the best offensive tackle duo in college football right there. Oregon was the nation's best team in sacks allowed per dropback. They were number 1. If they just beat Washington in the Pac-12 championship game, it would have been Oregon who won the Joe Moore Award, not Washington. Tez Johnson over 1,000 receiving yards last year. Terrence Ferguson is also a good tight end. Jordan James, I think, is going to have a 1,000-yard season after backing up Bucky Irving. And they're good. They do a fantastic job on the offensive line, recruiting, developing, substituting, etc. The top 2 offenses, in my opinion, are Georgia at 2 and Alabama at 1. For Georgia, they bring back Carson Beck. Their offensive line will be the best in the country. I'm high on new center Jared Wilson. And their guard play with Tate Ratledge, Dylan Fairchild, and Micah Morris is the best in all of college football. Ernest Green III and Xavier Truss, I think, make up a great offensive tackle duo that is only second in the SEC to Will Campbell and Emory Jones Jr. And they have Colby Young and Dylan Bell and Dominic Lovett and Arian Smith at wide receiver and Oscar Delp and incoming Stanford transfer Ben Urasek at tight end. And also incoming Florida transfer Trevor Etienne. However, the reason I have Alabama ahead of Georgia is because I look at Kalen DeBoer and the fact that he now has access to talent that he never had at Washington. I'd argue he had it at wide receiver, and Washington's receivers last year will be far better than Alabama's this season. But Alabama's got Jeremy Bernard, who would have been Washington's wide receiver 1 entering this year. Kobe Prentice, I think, is due to have a big year, especially with Jamarcus Shepard coaching him at wide receiver. Alabama has Caden Proctor and Elijah Pritchett at offensive tackle, Tyler Booker and Jaden Roberts at guard, and the nation's best center in Parker Brailsford, who led the Joe Moore Award-winning Washington Huskies offensive line last season. Also, Jam Miller and Justice Haynes will be quite the running back duo. And Jalen Milroe, I'm telling you right now, I'm just going to spoil it to make it simpler, and I may even make another additional video on it. Jalen Milroe is my Heisman pick because I think with better coaching, he'll be able to run for more yards, pass for more yards. He'll become much improved in the short and medium completion areas and throws. And I think consequentially, Alabama will have an offense that is humming nationally in college football. What I want to get to now is finally, it's taken us so much time, Florida State versus Georgia Tech. Let's just see. Yup, I have a pick. I have a pick right now. So let me pick my next team here on Squad Blitz. I have Iowa State, Boise State, Kentucky, Louisville, Arizona, Memphis, Auburn. Doesn't look like there are that many teams I'd actually want to get my hands on. Tell me in the comments, tell me in the chat, which team do you think I should pick? Should I pick Arizona, Iowa State, or Boise State? Which one of those teams should I pick? Ooh, this comment's really good. But before I get to this $50 super chat, and thank you, Adam Steven Bowers, for supporting the channel. But before I get to that, tell me what you all think. Who should I pick? Who should I draft? Which team should I draft in Squad Blitz? Let me know. Again, the options are Boise State, Iowa State, and Arizona. With Arizona, you're going to get the offense, particularly in the passing game. Boise State, you have the easiest schedule, probably best overall performance, but that's a risk because they're a group of 5, and they've been underperforming. With Iowa State, they have the most returning production, and if Matt Campbell puts everything together, the defense will be good, and the offense could be humming. Like, it could be a 2020 type Iowa State season. So let me know what you all think. And I will be patiently waiting in the chat for a few more seconds. Then I'll pick. Okie dokie. I think that given all of this, let me see, just maybe waiting around will be good. Boise. Thank you, Al Cervic, for letting me know. Okay, Boise it is. I'm picking the Broncos. I think that's a good selection. Right now, my selections are Oregon, Miami, Iowa, and Boise State. So those are the 4 teams that I have. Again, email me at collegefootballwithsam@gmail.com. Email me, and I will get you into my league. I'll also make a post about this detailing it further tomorrow. But Adam Steven Bowers, supporting the channel, thank you very much. Are you not concerned with Wink versus Sark, specifically Wink versus the RPO and quick pass game? I think there should be concern with Texas's speed. The RPO screen, they can RPO/screen Wink's blitz to death. Think how Shanahan and McVay have played him. I haven't watched the NFL all that much, so thank you for the insight. That's interesting, especially given that, Sark's offense does feature RPO. They have the receivers and the quarterback to pass quick, and I've watched them, use screens, sometimes to their own detriment, like in the Sugar Bowl against Washington. Yeah, that's one of my concerns, actually, with Wink Martindale at Michigan, is it could be like a Don Brown 2.0, where he gets very blitz happy and just puts strain on the secondary, which is the weakest part of Michigan's defense. And if you're Michigan, I think the game plan would be just only send 4. Try and cover the receivers all game, make Ewers throw into tight coverage. Michigan can get pressure on Texas's offensive line just by bringing 4, maybe 5 guys, and just stay disciplined in coverage. Because with CJ Baxter down, and with their other running back, whose name I forget, but prayers up to both of them, with them down, I don't think Texas will be running that much. Because A, you don't want to get even thinner at the position, and B, those backup running backs, including Jaden Blue, who I think is good, probably an underrated running back, he isn't as good as CJ Baxter. And Michigan's defensive line is going to be very good at slowing down the run. And if people believe that Texas will be able to just run all over Michigan, then look at Texas's offensive line stats versus Michigan's defensive line stats. And even further factor in the fact Michigan played in a tougher conference. And you'll see quickly, Michigan's defensive line will probably be better than Texas's offensive line. And I see what else you said in the chat. I've never played the sport of football, if you guys can't already tell. So when it comes to sets and splits and game film, I'm not an expert there, and I won't pretend to. But thank you for giving out details, Adam Steven Bowers. I really appreciate it. And I think that your concern about, or what you think Michigan fans' concerns should be about the Texas-Michigan game, I think it's valid. Michigan's replacing a lot on defense and a lot on offense, and Texas is going to probably have equal or more likely better chemistry compared to Michigan. If Michigan was playing this game at Texas, I would not dare pick Michigan to win. You're going down south in warmer environment. It's probably a 10 total point swing going from an environment as intimidating to the Big House as one that's as tough to play in like Darrell Royal Stadium. That's probably close to a double-digit point swing, if not a touchdown point swing. And I don't think that on a neutral field, I don't think that Michigan would be more than, this is the very best scenario, more than 10 points better than Texas. And they're probably, from my own opinion, 4, 5, 6, 7 points better than Texas. And especially this early in the season, this is the time for these teams to play if Texas wants to maximize their chances to win. Not later in the year when A, it's colder, but B, when Michigan finally gets some team chemistry under their belt. Thank you for supporting the channel. I got a $50 super chat yesterday, so this is awesome and a little overwhelming, but thanks. And also, everyone who's watching right now, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell. Do all of those things. Like, share, subscribe, click the notification bell. Email me at collegefootballwithsam@gmail.com so that you can sign up for Squadblitz. It's totally free. All I need is your email, and I'll send you an invite, and we can be in a college football fantasy league together, tracking the season as it goes. But now I'm getting to what I really want to get into, and it took me a little longer than I anticipated. But here goes nothing. I want to talk to you about Florida State versus Georgia Tech. This coming Saturday at noon Eastern Standard Time, it will be like 5 p.m. Ireland time, I think, or maybe 4 p.m. It's not going to be 6 p.m. It'll be 5 p.m. or 4 p.m. I know for a fact that Ireland is not they're not 6 hours ahead of the Eastern time zone because Spain, Portugal, and West Africa aren't. So that wouldn't make sense for Ireland to be that far ahead. But anyway, the football is what we're talking about here, not the time zones. Football in Ireland, I don't exactly know why we do it, but we do, and it's interesting. And I think more international games would be better as long as you're not taking away multiple home games. Then that's just stupid, ruins the fan experience. But the more fans we can get around the world for college football, I think the better, because I think it's the best sport in the history of not just America, but I know I'm biased in saying this, but I think it's the best sport in the entire world. So it's great. And I'm happy that this game is the first game of the regular season and not Notre Dame Navy, which was a 45-3 blowout in which everyone all of a sudden thought that Sam Hartman was the second coming until he wasn't. Anyway, Florida State is preseason top 10. They are ranked number 10. Exactly. So just inside that preseason top 10. They finished last year ranked 6th with a 13-1 record. Georgia Tech finished unranked but had their first bowl appearance since 2018, Paul Johnson's final season, and they had their first winning record also since that year. It's been quite some time. This past season, and in 2022, when Brent Key was the head coach and the interim head coach in 2022, Georgia Tech also competed with Georgia and gave them everything they got. So there's a spark that Georgia Tech has, I think, with Brent Key, especially with how they're recruiting, what they've brought back, the fact that they looked competent and good offensively last year in spite of one of the country's worst defenses. And for Florida State, well, Florida State's back. They won the ACC. They were snubbed from the college football playoff. They did everything that was in their control. Everything. They should have been in there, whether you wanted to place them as a 4th seed, a 3rd seed. You could not have placed them higher than that because undefeated Washington and Michigan A were better and had superior strength of schedules. But they should have been 3rd or 4th. And it should have been Alabama, or maybe in a more objective world, because I think Alabama was better than Texas, maybe it should have been Texas that was left out. And Florida State and Alabama and Michigan and Washington in. But regardless, Florida State was snubbed. But they're back, and Georgia Tech is on the rise. Both of these teams have motivation, and they have all the reasons in the world to want this game, to need this game. Georgia Tech's schedule, for example, is one of the toughest, if not the toughest, in the ACC. They play Florida State, Notre Dame, Miami, NC State, and Georgia. 5 preseason top 25 opponents. Notre Dame, Georgia, and Florida State are preseason top 10, so 3 preseason top 10 opponents. Their non-conference schedule is Notre Dame, Georgia, VMI, and Georgia State. Thank goodness for VMI and Georgia State, because a non-conference schedule of Notre Dame and Georgia is insanity. But Georgia Tech signed up for that because they play Georgia annually, and I think that's beautiful. No reason to shy away from a rivalry like Georgia and Georgia Tech, which is better than a lot of other rivalries that people would believe are better than clean old-fashioned hate. For Florida State, they also play a tough schedule. They're out of conference as Memphis, which is one of the best Group of 5 teams. It is also Notre Dame, Charleston Southern, and Florida. Florida will be average, I think. Not good, like many power rankings believe. I think they're overrating Florida due to Graham Mertz being inflated by his statistics last season. Partly garbage time. Other part is the fact that the offense was designed to be easy. But they'll be average. They will be better than their record indicates for sure. Notre Dame on the road in November is going to be painful. And Memphis, after it is after a bye, so that can be a good thing or a bad thing. And I think Memphis especially needs that game if they want to get into the college football playoff, because Memphis beating Florida State, which, do not hate me for saying this, it's possible, given all that Memphis brings back, all that Florida State loses. It's highly unlikely, but it's possible. It's one of the more likely Group of 5 over Power 4 upsets. If Memphis wins that game, as long as they win their conference, they're guaranteed to be in. Because I don't see Boise State beating Oregon. That's far less likely in my mind. Mainly because Memphis has a better quarterback, they have better receivers, and Boise State trying to run the ball and out special teams Oregon won't matter when the high octane Ducks will just roll them over. But Florida State's schedule and Georgia Tech's are both tough. They need this game. They need it to provide momentum, and more so, as for Florida State, to not get embarrassed, to not have what could be not a program-defining loss, but certainly a season-defining loss. And for Georgia Tech, their schedule is so tough that they need all the wins that they can get. They do. Whether that is to boost recruiting, which is doing very well under Brent Key, or to reach the ACC championship game, which is likely because their toughest games of the season by preseason rankings and power ratings will be non-conference games against Notre Dame and against Georgia. So that's really the background for this Week 0 game. And Florida State's favored right now by 11 points per ESPN. The over-under is 55.5. Georgia Tech's plus 360 money line. Florida State is minus 450. I want to look at Florida State's defense and Georgia Tech's offense. Florida State's defense last year was 13th in offensive points allowed per game. They only allowed 18.2. They only allowed 0.285 points per play last season, which was 16th. They allowed 340.2 total yards per game, not rushing yards per game, but total yards per game, which was 31st. They played a pretty bend-but-don't-break defense and only forced about 1.2 turnovers per game, and they returned 57% of their defensive production. So this defense very easily could take a step back. They were outside the top 25 in rushing yards per game. Georgia Tech, meanwhile, was inside the top 15 in rushing yards per game. They ran for over 200 rushing yards last year and over 5 yards per carry, which is very impressive. Jamal Haynes and Haynes King led the team in rushing yards, and Eric Singleton Jr. is a great receiver. Weston Franklin, Joe Fussile, and Jordan Williams are some of the nation's better offensive linemen too. And their tight end room has some players as well. This offense with Buster Faulkner as the offensive coordinator, who was an assistant and analyst under Todd Monken during his tenure at Georgia, he has revolutionized Tech's offense. Gone with the obsolete and disgusting and slow Jeff Collins offenses. The triple option, while Paul Johnson worked it to perfection, has its limitations. This offense, I'm telling you right now, has the potential to be a top 10 offense. Now, that may not matter if the defense for Georgia Tech doesn't improve, but we'll get there. Florida State's defense brings back Patrick Payton and Joshua Farmer and DJ Lundy and Fentrell Cypress II and Azariah Thomas. You look at their depth chart that I have displayed to all of you, and what I see in this matchup, this is the most fascinating matchup by a mile, because you look at Florida State's offense versus Georgia Tech's defense, and if you only looked at that, if I only showed you that, you'd tell me, well, Florida State's going to win this game by 40 because Georgia Tech's defense sucks. They don't return anything, which can be a good thing when your defense is that bad, but it's never a guarantee. And while Florida State's offense does lose a lot, they bring back much of their offensive line, and they use the portal to help reload at running back and at least get a good player at quarterback in DJ Uiagalelei. But I do want to check out these statistics on the offense and defense. For Florida State last season, let's dive a little deeper. They had 46 sacks. And who led the team, may you ask? Well, it was Jared Verse with 9, but Patrick Payton had 7 sacks, and he had 9 passes defended and 2 forced fumbles. On the defensive line as well, Joshua Farmer had 5 sacks and 2 passes defended and a forced fumble. A defensive back, Shaheem Brown, who starts at safety, had 2 sacks, 53 total tackles, a pick, and 4 passes defended. And you also look at Azariah Thomas. He had, along with Fentrell Cypress, nearly double-digit passes defended. They're some of the best cornerbacks in the country. Azariah Thomas had 10 passes defended. 10. That's very impressive. And Fentrell Cypress, on the other hand, had 7 passes defended. And Thomas and Cypress each had a forced fumble and a fumble recovery. And Azariah Thomas also had a half sack for a total of 7 yards. This defense is aggressive. They will get to the quarterback. They had 76 passes defended last year. I mean, their secondary, I'm telling you, is good. 76 passes defended is a jarring statistic. They may have led the country in passes defended per game. That's very impressive. And on top of that, they had 14 forced fumbles, 10 picks. This defense isn't going anywhere, even losing Jared Verse and Braden Fisk and Renardo Green and Kalen DeLoach. They're not going anywhere. They may take a step back. They may actually improve because there is a lot of ground to improve on the run defense for Florida State. But I think that they're going to be at least a good, great defense. For Georgia Tech, offensively, the Yellow Jackets last season had 2,649 rushing yards per game, and they averaged 5.4 yards per carry with 24 rushing touchdowns. I'm a Michigan fan. Those numbers are 2021 Michigan stuff on the ground. That's very impressive. Jamal Haynes had 1,000 rushing yards, averaged 6 yards per carry, and had 7 rushing touchdowns. Haynes King was only sacked 15 times, and he averaged 6.1 yards per carry. He had 10 rushing touchdowns and 737 rushing yards. On the receiving end, Eric Singleton Jr. and Malik Rutherford each had over 500 receiving yards and 4 or more receiving touchdowns. And again, the offensive line only allowed 15 sacks. That factors in that they play Georgia every year, so their schedule is always going to be at least somewhat of a challenge, if not hard. I love this offense for Georgia Tech, and I like the defense for Florida State. This matchup, on the other hand, screams Florida State. The other one, you can go back and forth and debate all day. But offensively for Florida State, a unit that was top 30 in points per play, offensive points per game, offensive touchdowns per game, inside the top 40 in yards per play, and just outside the top 50 in yards per game. But keep in mind, with a healthy Jordan Travis and with Florida State's ideal system working in their favor, they were much better than this. Jordan Travis, suffering the injury he did, which really sucked, did not help Florida State against Florida, Louisville, or Georgia, particularly on offense. The defense, their statistics got punched down by Georgia. They held their ground against Florida and Louisville and had a very impressive performance in those games. But this offense last season at times looked like a top 10 offense. Remember what they did against LSU, what they were able to do against, it's really that LSU game, wasn't it? I mean, what they did against Clemson to a certain degree was impressive. The yards they got and what they did, not just with the defense forcing those stops and getting the defensive touchdown, but Clemson's defense was really good. And Florida State's offense last year did not do them favors with an inconsistent ground attack, going up against a defense whose strength was the front and the linebackers. So Florida State, being a little one-dimensional, did well in that Clemson game. But anyway, Florida State will start at wide receiver Malik Benson, Jalen Brown, and Ja'Kai Douglas. Those players are mostly new because Keon Coleman is gone. Johnny Wilson is gone. Jaheim Bell, who could be a wide receiver or a tight end, he's gone. And then Malik Benson, he's gone at running back, replaced by incoming transfer Roydell Williams. Jordan Travis is gone, and DJ Uiagalelei replaces him at quarterback. The strength of this unit is Darius Washington, Jeremiah Byers at tackle, Richie Leonard IV, and Keandre Jones at guard, and Maurice Smith at center, who's one of the best centers in the country. I think really only behind Parker Brailsford of Alabama and Joe Michalski at Oklahoma State. He's up there with those elite centers. Georgia Tech's defense is a little different of a story. They were outside of the top 100 in offensive points allowed per game, yards per game allowed, yards per play allowed. They were top 15 in takeaways per game, though. But that really makes the statistics look even worse. I actually think it's a good thing. It's beneficial for Georgia Tech that they return less than half of their production on defense from last year, because their production really wasn't that good. They only had 21 sacks. They had 14 picks and 11 fumble recoveries and 49 passes defended. But in the same way that Georgia Tech would run on opponents all day long, you could run on Georgia Tech all day long. So Kyle Efford at linebacker, who led them in tackles, had a sack, a pick, 81 total tackles. He needs to step up. Others need to step up too, whether it's Zeke Biggers on the interior of that defensive line, or Thomas Gore, Kevin Harris, Romello Height, who's transferring in from USC. That front needs to do well, because Rodney Smith and Clayton Powell-Lee have done their job on defense and in the secondary in a much better way than the front has. For Florida State, their best returning player on offense outside of the offensive lineman is probably either Kyle Morlock or Lawrence Toafili. Toafili had 463 rushing yards last year, 4 rushing touchdowns, and 6.7 yards per carry. Morlock had 255 receiving yards, no receiving touchdowns, but he was behind Jaheim Bell. I think he transferred in. Yeah, he transferred in from a lower level school. I think he's ready to take a big step forward this season. Now that I have all these matchups out of the way, I am going to come forward and say that I think Florida State's going to win, but I do believe Georgia Tech at the end of the day is going to cover. My final score is 35-27 in favor of Florida State. I think that with Florida State being the team that has more incoming transfers, that has less overall experience, and honestly, Georgia Tech has, I think, more to lose here than Florida State does. Florida State, they lose this game mainly due to the fact that Georgia Tech will probably have the best rushing offense in the ACC. Well, Florida State literally could still win 10 games. They could maybe even win out. I kid you not, because it's this early in the year and they have a lot of new pieces. For Georgia Tech, as I've said, I think Brent Key is chasing greatness. I think that every win that comes their way, they're going to have to chase after because their schedule's tough. I think that overall, I'm telling you, Georgia Tech is going to be in this game for longer than people think. But at the same time, Florida State's way too good. They're too well coached. And I said earlier that I think Georgia Tech may need this game more. I'm actually going to take that back. I'm going to rescind that opinion. I don't think any team necessarily needs this game more than the other, because both need it desperately. Georgia Tech needs it desperately if they want to do more than just clinch bowl eligibility or chase bowl eligibility. And Florida State needs this if they want to maximize their chances of getting into the playoff and pursuing a national title, which, by the way, I think that Florida State can do that. I think that Florida State can not only win the ACC this year, they could contend to win it all if things go their way. And how do they start that process? They win this game. DJ Uiagalelei does what the Florida State staff has said he's doing everything that they need him to do in fall camp. The offense comes together behind one of the best offensive lines in the country, and the receivers step up. I think what Florida State will do in this game is eventually find out that they can run Lawrence Toafili and Roydell Williams and occasionally DJ Uiagalelei behind their offensive line and slow the game down, constrict Georgia Tech. And I don't think Georgia Tech will be able to halt this Florida State offense if they just play behind their offensive line. And outside of pounding the rock, which they can afford to do in this game, mix in play action, get their young receivers involved, and I think they'll win. I think Georgia Tech will cover. I do think this game will hit the over on virtue of the fact that Florida State's defense will take more than a game, I think, to be as good or perhaps better than last year's defense. Georgia Tech's defense will not be a good unit, I don't think, and both offenses will be good offenses. I think Georgia Tech's will, in fact, be a great offense. So thank you for watching. It's kind of an awkward way of ending it, but thank you all very much for being on here. Oh, it is my turn now. It is my turn for Squad Blitz. Okay, this is going to be the final act of the show, and then we'll be done here. What teams I have left to pick? I have Wisconsin. I have Nebraska. I have Kentucky, Virginia Tech, and Iowa State. What team do you all think that I should pick out of those? Let me know. Again, Iowa State, Virginia Tech, Kentucky, Wisconsin, and Nebraska. Out of all of those teams, in terms of offensive production, I gotta tell you, I'd probably look at Virginia Tech, and Virginia Tech has enough pieces on defense to where I think that they could be really good. Wisconsin's schedule's too tough for me to want to pick them in Squad Blitz. But outside of that, this is very tight. So, what do you all think out of those teams? And then we'll get off of here. By the way, thank you all so much for watching, and remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. I appreciate it a lot. Nebraska, says Wolvergeek. Anyone else? Because I'm very tempted to pick what he said, especially given their favorable schedule. You know what? Go Big Red. I'm doing it. I've picked Nebraska. So that is my fifth team, along with Boise State, Iowa, Miami, and Oregon. And we have Nebraska as team number 5. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. We will be going live often. I did not have the time to edit the banner that I want to put in every one of my videos, which lets people know when I'm going to go live, and I'm going to be going live a lot more often this season. But yeah, that's me. And I'll get that out this Wednesday when I'll be going live again. I'll have that banner down below, which will let everyone know that I'm going to be going live multiple times during the week. The times I haven't exactly figured out yet, but I'm close. They'll all be at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, though. So if I'm going to go live, it will likely be at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If not, I'll let you guys know. So thank you for watching, and I will see you all around. Bye-bye.